So I'm going to give you a little bit of an introduction about Atrani Trading Solutions and what we do on the planet today. A brief history of social media inside the financial markets, because I think you might be quite surprised that the financial markets have been using social media for a lot longer than you might think. And then look at social media and banking today and about how they're not adopting the mainstream. And then come on to the regulations and how they're affected and why people are affected by the regulations that not necessarily get put in place by our government, but quite often get put in place by other governments. And then look at a market abuse case, which is actually being investigated at the moment, which I've fictitiously created the solution for, or the way that it came about, so that I can give you an insight into the fact that it's not actually what you post. Sometimes it's just the fact that you've posted something that people can read some intent from. So if I move on to Atrani Trading Solutions, just to give you a very brief idea about what we do, we actually manufacture trader turrets. So the big bits of telephone that sit on the trader desktops that you've seen in all the movies, we make those and we pass them out to about 20% of the market. So we make those telephones that can have loads and loads of telephone calls going on them at the same time. We have a trading grade network, which includes about 2,000 members globally. That's a fibre optic network, which includes a lot of dark fibre, which I recently learned has got nothing to do with Harry Potter, but actually means that it's just fibre that's not being used at the time. So alongside that trading grade network, we have what we call the compliance services part of our business. And this is where we really look at recording the phones and the mobile phones of all of the trading communities, so the financial markets. You can see here we've got about 300,000 recorded channels globally. That's not 300,000 individuals. That's probably about 30,000 individuals, or maybe a touch more than that, because each one of those traders will have more than one line coming into their desktop. The newest piece, which has come to light in the last couple of years, is the mobile phone recording, which is really booming at the moment. We've done a very soft launch on our new mobile phone capability with EE, which is the only network in the UK that supports mobile phone recording. So we've actually launched a new product which allows anybody to record information, and we're getting a lot of inquiries from even outside the financial market. So law enforcement, healthcare, lone worker is another area that we're seeing an awful lot of interest in, being able to record conversations that your employees are making. And I think you can see the applications of that fairly clearly. But let's move on to a brief history of financial markets and how they've dealt with social media. You might not realise, but actually the financial markets have been using a tool for social communication in their own community for about 30 years. What's the name of that tool? It's called Bloomberg. You might not be familiar with Bloomberg. I know Sean's in the audience somewhere. He knows it quite well. He's over there waving. Sean and I had the pleasure and the privilege of working for Bloomberg for about 20 years altogether, I think, if you combine it. We were involved quite heavily in the promotion of that product, so we understand exactly how it works. My last 10 years at the company were dealing with the retention of that data and how traders, salespeople, compliance officers, the police, the financial regulator got access to that data to see whether people had done anything wrong. There are other systems that do financial markets information, so Thomson Reuters will be one. In fact, Thomson Reuters owns most of the foreign exchange market. But outside of the foreign exchange market, about 95% of all financial markets transactions take place on the Bloomberg terminal. If you look at any of the financial scandals that you've seen in the newspapers, you'll see that the LIBOR case, Baring Brothers, even down to the UBS swaps transactions that took place in 2008, 2009 that caused UBS to lose $6 billion, all of the communication took place over the Bloomberg terminal. All of the quotes that you got from Barclays Bank on the LIBOR case, people talking about how much champagne they're going to buy each other for fixing the LIBOR rates, those quotes came directly from Bloomberg messages. So it's really interesting to see how the financial markets work in this social community where they can communicate with each other, they can communicate with somebody that they've never met before but works for a firm that they want to talk to. The volume of data that goes over these systems is quite terrifying. There are over 160 million delivered messages a day on the Bloomberg network. That is a fantastic figure if you start breaking it down. Quite a lot of these messages are not read, but if you are actually on the receiving end of those messages and you know where to look for your data when you want to go and look for it, it can be a really useful source of information. Bloomberg has about 600 terabytes of data under its belt, and I'm sure it shares that kind of data or that kind of amount of data with many of the other financial markets providers. Right now, they're looking at over 270,000 users, and they have near global coverage. I think North Korea and Iraq are probably the only two countries, Iran, the only two countries they don't really look at. So I think you can see that the financial markets understands how the flow of these information works very well, and they've had this closed social media group going on for a very long time. Let's have a look and see how they're doing in the other spaces, so in the media that you might recognise more often. So let's talk about normal communication. For normal communications, they will use Bloomberg, Thomson Reuters, instant messages, Skype and email. They're all closed communities. They're such a closed community actually that Bloomberg used to have a tagline on their name which was for the chosen few. They got rid of it after a little bit of a backlash in the non-financial markets, saying that it was just too expensive a toy. Just to give you some idea, if you want to go and buy a Bloomberg terminal today, it'll cost you $2,000 a month to have it sitting on your desktop. So I think you can see that the normal pieces of communication, as you would expect them, exist right now. If you look at some of the other ways that banks use social media, recruitment is one of the areas where they're coming heavily into it. Facebook, web pages and LinkedIn are all used for recruiting people, for looking through people's backgrounds and working out whether they should be an employee in their organisation. I do have to say that an awful lot of financial markets participants use LinkedIn and their Facebook pages as signpost pages. They don't have active content on them, they don't encourage likes, they don't put posts on there. And actually, while we're talking about it, one of the interesting things about the financial markets, particularly from the United States, and a lot of what we do in the UK is driven by what happens in the United States. The SEC and FINRA, when they open up again after the US has shut down for the moment because they've run out of money, when they get back in business, they're actually at the moment cogitating whether a like on a Facebook page could be seen as an offer to sell or a recommendation to buy a certain security. So if I was a broker and I happened to put up a message about the fact that I was running a new issue in a particular stock and somebody else liked it, is that a recommendation? If that stock then tanks, do I get to go and sue the guy that recommended the stock? So there's a lot of considerations above and beyond the normal stuff that Steve was talking about to do with the law in the financial markets as well. The third area that the banks get involved in, and this is where you will probably all seen them, is in Twitter, Facebook, email to a certain extent, and other types of communication where they are really looking at customer services and marketing. HSBC was announced this week as having the largest presence on the social media space. And one of the factors that came into this, I think is really interesting, is that they have reduced their average customer service time, so the time from which a customer gets in touch with them with a complaint or a question, from 11 hours, which is what Barclays currently has, down to 2.5 hours. That's quite an amazing statistic when you look at what they've done. And what's interesting as well is that HSB came up with their social media strategy from the fact that they had a really bad outage that some of you might remember that caused all their cash machines to stop working. So they started using social media to tell people when cash machines were coming back online and when those cash machines had money put in them. Incidentally, while we're talking about social media and the control centres, HSBC has spent about $5 million on putting a control centre in place for its global social media applications. But other organisations such as Dell Computing have spent even more, I think they're up to about $12 million now, and they've got the most amazing suite of information that can be gleaned from what they're doing. Michael Dell was talking about this recently when he actually got caught by his daughter and asked, I've got somebody on Twitter who's in Dell hell, and that was the whole thing, started off there. So he spent an awful lot of money and raised their brand awareness there. So when we talk about media and social media in particular in the financial markets, we want to know how compliant each one of these tools are. And compliance means lots of different things to different people. In the context that I'm talking about it today, I'm talking about financial markets rules, how easy it is to retain the data and how easy it is to be able to produce the data should you want to. And I'm going to go on to the regulations in the next slide, but suffice to say, if you're in the financial markets and you're posting anything on social media, you have to retain that data for a period of time so that if anybody wants to come and look at it and ask you why you did what you did, you can prove it to them. So let's have a look at this. Interesting graph. On the left-hand side, right the way over to the right-hand side, you can see that there are some comparisons and differences between how easy it is to store data or retrieve it. You'd expect that Bloomberg and Thomson Reuters, the financial markets participants or the financial markets communication tools, would be easy to do. In fact, both of those systems have tools that are actually inbuilt in them. They will retain customers' data for a period of time. They'll allow you to search on that data. They'll even allow you to run keyword searches and monitor and alert you when a particular bit of content goes over that system. As you move over to the right, you can see that email pages and web pages are just as easy to capture and to monitor. And then you get down to the new social media types. And this is really the reason why many of the banks have not used social media in their investment banking arms. It's because it's too difficult to get to a point where you can capture all of that data, have it pushed into your other archive, and include it with everything else you're doing. There are solutions for capturing this data, but you need to be able to combine it together and have a unified archive if you're going to stop yourself from having 15 people working in your archiving section. As you move over to the right, you can see that it gets worse and worse until you get down to Skype, which is one of the most difficult ones to capture because of the encrypted nature of the conversations. It is, of course, possible to capture it when you and I are looking after our own PCs, but actually having the data reside on your worker's desktop is not really where you want it to be because it's too easy for them to kick the desk or kick the machine under the table and stop it from being there anymore. So it's one of the tools that tends to get used least inside the financial markets. Fixed line voice and mobile voice, you can see the differences there, and I've talked enough about that already. So let's move on to the regulations and why people do what they do. In the UK, we're driven by MiFID, which is a piece of legislation brought down from Europe. MiFID II, which is the imaginatively named follow-up to MiFID, will come into place in 2014. The European regulators are currently arguing about how they implement the things inside MiFID or MiFID II. MiFID, as it stood as a piece of legislation, required financial institutions to keep data if the member state, so the country that you live in, opted to be part of this legislation. For MiFID II, they've actually said it's mandatory. So you've got an awful lot of countries that didn't take part in MiFID, and you'll be pleased to know that the UK did take part in MiFID and did require people to store their data for 6 months. MiFID II will now require data to be stored for a longer period of time, so probably 3 years, and will also include countries like Germany, France, Italy, Spain, Portugal, who weren't part of the original MiFID coalition, if you like. So what I guess the UK regulator is trying to do is also help and be a thought leader in bringing to market some of the things that come into place when you retain data. Really interesting to learn about the kind of privacy aspects of data. We come across that quite often where people in one country have their data retained in another country. In the EU it's quite simple because there's data privacy directives that apply. But when you're pushing that data out to the United States, and everybody, I hope, will have heard of the PRISM program that allows the US government to look at pretty much any data they want, along with many other bits of legislation, such as the Patriot Act, which allow any federal agent, including the water board and the dog catchers, to actually walk into a data center and take data without a warrant, just by literally turning up and saying, I want that computer. It really gives you some very interesting insights into the way that works and whether you want to store your data in the United States. For most of us, it won't matter, but if you're a Swiss bank that's got customers that don't necessarily want their details given out to the US authorities, then it can matter quite a lot. So at the moment in the UK, if you are a financial markets participant and you are regulated by the FCA or the FSA, as it used to be called, then you should retain your data for 6 months. But most people retain their data for longer. And why is that? Well, the USA has probably one of the most stringent records retention requirements of anybody in the world, probably except for South Korea, which asks you to keep data for 10 years. The USA asks you to keep data for 5 years. Voice calls are now required to be kept, if you're a swaps trader, for 1 year. The Securities and Exchange Commission, along with FINRA and the CFTC, and the CFTC might be one that you've not heard of, is a new body which really governs the trading of futures and swaps transactions. So these are the things which are well diagnosed to have caused the downfall and the downturn in all of our lives in terms of the recessions that went on from 2008 onwards. The CFTC has been charged with cleaning up an awful lot of that market, and one of the things that they've put in place is the retention of voice data, not only your fixed line data, but the data had on mobile phones. So in the United States, that really conflicts quite well with some of the other laws they've got in place for wiretap. So in the States, after Nixon was impeached for doing what he did, the wiretap laws were put in place to stop people from illegally recording phone conversations. There is a situation in the States now that exists where you can have a one-party state or an all-party state. So if you're making a phone call, you can actually, on a conference call, have to require several people on that conference call to give their consent, or at least have a notification that the call will be recorded. The other piece of legislation actually I missed out on the United Kingdom is a piece of legislation called the Market Abuse Directive, appropriately titled MAD. They're bringing out another version of it. Unfortunately, it's not called MADA, it's called MAD 2. But that will also involve people having to look at the communications that their employees transact. So look at the emails, look at the tweets, look at everything that they send in order to make sure that they are not contravening the Market Abuse Directive. And the example that I'm going to give you later actually shows an interesting way that people could get caught for contravening the Market Abuse Directive, even though they haven't done something blatant. One of the things that does come into all of this when we look at the global world is actually being a bank is quite a difficult job when you're globally based. We all want our banks to behave like banks, but it's a difficult world when you have to look at all of the privacy regulations globally, along with all the records retention requirements. What you don't want to do is put yourself in a position where the regulator turns up and says, I want some data, and you go and look for your data where you think you've put it and it's not there. So you tend to find that people in the financial community are very, very particular about how their data is stored and where their data is stored. So let's move on to a fictional example, which is kind of taken from a real example. So all of the names and all of the companies and everything that I've put together here is totally fictional. It shouldn't be related to anybody as being part of this particular scandal that's taking place at the moment. But I want to walk you through it because I think it's quite interesting to see how things get taken out of context or maybe just looked at differently by the financial regulator. So let's start off with a young man who has a Twitter account. You can see I've obliterated his face here to protect his identity. He likes his Twitter account and he follows a broker called Broker X. Now, brokers are interesting pieces in the market, or interesting players in the market. They have their own regulatory structure, and they actually sit right in the middle of everybody in the street. So they pass information from one place to another without necessarily telling where the information came from. So if somebody wants to buy a large amount of stock or wants to go into a particular trade, they will give that information to the broker, and the broker will then sanitize the information and pass it out to the street so that they can get the best price for that trade or the best deal in the market for what they're looking at. So brokers are hungry for information. They're always looking for little angles and ways of finding things out. Peter also follows Jane. Jane is a sales executive at another trading company. Now Jane is working on a really big deal at the moment. It's a stock issuance, so an IPO as we might know it, and she's trying to get the best price and the best deal into the public space as she can. But IPOs are covered by an awful lot of law to do with insider trading and everything else. That information should never leave the company or the organisation that's running the IPO. However, Jane has a bad day and she tweets about it. Now you might think that's a pretty innocent tweet. There's nothing particularly wrong with that tweet, except, she has said that she's had a bad day. Could you read something into that tweet if you knew a little bit about what she was doing? Well, you might be able to. But actually, what's really interesting about it is that Peter then grabs hold of that message and retweets it. So Peter's retweeted the fact that he's also had a bad day. But what's interesting about that is that Broker X is following Peter. And because Broker X is following Peter, now the information has kind of gone mainstream. So it's not just gone to Jane's followers, it's now gone to everybody that is inside Broker X. So Broker X now knows what's going on. But really the confidentiality about the deal that she's working on is intact. So Steve, who works for Broker X, thinks, maybe I want to do something about this. So asks if you fancy having a few at the Slug in Canary Wharf. For those of you who don't know, there is a pub in Canary Wharf called the Slug and Lettuce. It's a fine establishment that many of us have spent many hours in. But if you go in there as a journalist, you definitely wouldn't want to put your fingers in your ears because everything is being discussed in that particular pub. Now, I don't know, and as I said, all of the people I've put in here, including the tweets and the pictures, are fictional. But this is a real live example of something that's being investigated by the Financial Control Authority right now. So it's an interesting place because nobody really knows what happens in the Slug. Nobody knows what gets discussed. But if that broker suddenly is able to go and buy stock or is able to pitch for a particular piece of information or now understands something better than he did before, then what happens in the pub doesn't always stay in the pub. If Jane got found guilty of insider trading on this front because she'd had a conversation with Steve, she'd be looking at 7 years inside. That's not a good place to be, 7-year prison sentence just for putting a tweet out. So financial markets have their own problems. I think as far as the way in which social media works, interesting comments from the panel earlier to do with everybody's a human being and you're entitled to have a Twitter account or a Facebook page. But I think you can see there are some things that you might want to keep a little bit more private. So, very quick conclusions. Social media use is growing inside the financial institutions. You'll see that as the technology to control and capture the way in which information gets disseminated goes out, you'll see it becoming more prevalent. And you will see people with their names up saying swaps trader at HSBC with some information going out. It's not yet used for trading because of the difficulties in capture and surveillance. Again, spent a little bit of time on that. I'm happy to expand on it if anybody wants to. Really interesting one here. The financial markets are quite an old space. And as you look at the people who are coming into the space, you'll see that the younger generation that's coming up from university now are definitely pushing the move towards social media. I think there were some interesting comments about the dynamics and about who is actually using social media at the moment. Very much in the financial market space, you'll see the younger people using it. So technical capabilities are starting to catch up with the requirements. I would expect to see very, very soon the ability to capture and monitor this stuff as a mainstream part of almost everybody on the street. At the moment, you can see people like Goldman Sachs and Barclays and HSBC are using it as a corporate communication tool. They're not using it to drum up business. But there's one place that we haven't been yet, and that is in the privacy and human rights. If you're a financial markets participant and you've got a LinkedIn account, there are some that might say that you should have to give up all of the information on that LinkedIn account to your employer so that they can monitor it and make sure you're not committing any market abuse. In the States, they've already started to test this. It's not being tested in Europe at the moment because I think most of the banks feel that if you went and asked somebody for their LinkedIn account, then you'd probably be treading on some very big toes. That will change as we go forward. Now, you know, there's simple ways of dealing with this. You have two LinkedIn accounts. You have a private one and you have a business or a work one. The trouble is, when you get to put up the fact that you're a swaps trader at HSBC on your private account, that also gives an indication to people about what you do. So I think there's some stuff that still needs to be tested, and I think we'll see that in the coming few years. Maybe not in the next few months, because I think the banks have got their hands full with some capital adequacy problems at the moment. But we're definitely seeing things moving in that direction. That's it from me. Thank you very much.